My uncle raised his wine glass high above the dinner table, his booming laugh echoing through the crowded family restaurant as he pointed directly at me. "Look at our little Rachel here," he announced to the entire extended family, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. 36 years old and still renting that sad little apartment downtown, working her meaningless desk job while the rest of us actually built something with our lives. The whole table erupted in uncomfortable chuckles as my face burned with humiliation. What Uncle Greg didn't know was that I had $51 million sitting in my accounts, and I was about to make his entire world crumble. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I should have seen this humiliation coming the moment I walked into Romano's Italian Bistro that cold February evening in Cleveland. The restaurant buzzed with the familiar chaos of our extended family gatherings, Uncle Greg's booming voice cutting through conversations, Aunt Linda's shrill laughter piercing the air, and the clatter of oversized wine glasses against checkered tablecloths. I had driven my modest Honda Civic through the slushy streets after finishing another long day at North Star Advisory, where I worked as a senior financial analyst. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days managing millions in client portfolios while my own family saw me as nothing more than a struggling office worker barely scraping by. Uncle Greg stood at the head of the long table, his portly frame squeezed into an expensive navy blazer that couldn't quite hide his growing beer gut. At 58, he still commanded attention with his silver hair perfectly styled and his Rolex catching the warm restaurant lighting. This was his birthday celebration, and as usual, he had turned it into his personal stage. "Rachel, sweetie," he called out, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise over the years. "Come sit next to your successful cousins. Maybe some of their ambition will rub off on you." I forced a smile and took my seat between my cousin Mark, who worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, and my cousin Jenna, a real estate agent who never missed an opportunity to mention her latest commission. The rest of the family filled the remaining chairs, aunts, uncles, and distant relatives who only surfaced for these obligatory gatherings. Greg raised his wine glass, the burgundy liquid sloshing slightly as his voice grew louder. "I want to make a toast," he announced, his eyes scanning the table with theatrical pride. "To family success stories." My stomach churned. I knew where this was heading. "Look at Mark here," Greg continued, gesturing toward my cousin with his free hand. "Just bought himself a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Westlake. Pool, 3-car garage, the works. And our Jenna, she's pulling in 6 figures selling luxury homes in Beechwood." Polite applause rippled around the table as Mark and Jenna beamed with pride. I stared down at my untouched lasagna, the melted cheese already starting to congeal. "But then," Greg's voice dropped to a stage whisper that somehow carried to every corner of our section, "we have our dear Rachel." Every conversation stopped. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and I felt my cheeks burn with the familiar heat of public embarrassment. Greg's wife Linda covered her mouth with her napkin, trying to hide what looked suspiciously like a smirk. 36 years old, Greg announced with exaggerated sympathy. "And still living in that cramped little apartment on the east side? What is it? Rachel, 800 square feet. No dishwasher. Street parking only." He shook his head with mock concern. "Working at some tiny financial firm where she shuffles papers all day and probably makes what, 40, 50,000 a year." The number was so wildly off that I almost laughed. Instead, I gripped my fork tighter and maintained my composure. "Uncle Greg," I said quietly, "maybe we could—" "Oh, don't be embarrassed." "Honey," he interrupted, waving his hand dismissively, "we all have different paths in life. Some of us are meant to build empires." He gestured toward himself with obvious pride. "And others are meant to, well, survive." The table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even my younger cousins, usually glued to their phones, looked up with wide eyes. Aunt Margaret, Greg's sister, cleared her throat awkwardly. "Greg," she said softly, "maybe that's enough?" No, let me finish," Greg insisted. his voice growing more animated with each sip of wine. "I think it's important for the younger generation to understand the difference between success and mediocrity." He turned back to me, his smile sharp and cruel. "Rachel here represents what happens when you don't take risks, when you play it safe your whole life. No husband, no house, no real career prospects. Just a sad little existence in a sad little apartment, probably eating frozen dinners every night and watching Netflix until she falls asleep on her second-hand couch." The accuracy of some of his details stung, even though they painted an incomplete picture. I did eat frozen dinners sometimes, and yes, my couch was from Craigslist. But what Greg couldn't see, what none of them could see, was the carefully constructed facade I'd maintained for years. "I'm sorry if I've disappointed you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg's laugh boomed across the restaurant, causing other diners to turn and stare. "Disappointed? Oh, sweetheart, you can't disappoint someone who never had expectations in the first place." The cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten and my hands begin to tremble. This wasn't just family teasing or good-natured ribbing. This was deliberate humiliation, designed to elevate himself by destroying me in front of everyone who mattered. As the conversation gradually shifted to safer topics and the attention moved away from me, I sat in stunned silence, mechanically eating my cooling lasagna. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The embarrassment was transforming into something much more dangerous, a cold, calculating anger that I'd been suppressing for far too long. Uncle Greg had no idea that his little financial empire was crumbling, that his construction supply company was drowning in debt, or that he'd been desperately seeking investors for months. Most importantly, he had no idea that his worthless niece had the power to either save him or destroy him completely. The choice, I realized with crystal clarity, had just been made for me. The humiliation at Romano's wasn't my first taste of Uncle Greg's cruelty. It was simply the latest chapter in a lifelong pattern that stretched back to my earliest memories. As I drove home through the empty Cleveland streets that night, my mind drifted to the countless moments when Greg had systematically torn down my confidence, always under the guise of family concern. I was 8 years old when my parents died in that devastating car accident on Interstate 71. One moment I had a loving mother and father who called me their little genius for my exceptional math skills. And the next, I was a confused orphan being shuffled between relatives who saw me as an unwanted burden. Greg, as my father's older brother and the most financially stable family member, became my legal guardian, a role he accepted with theatrical reluctance. "Don't worry, everyone," I remembered him announcing at my parents' funeral reception. "Little Rachel will have a roof over her head. We Monroes take care of our own, even when it's inconvenient." The word inconvenient had branded itself into my 8-year-old mind like a hot iron. From that moment forward, every interaction with Greg carried the underlying message that I was a charity case, a disruption to his perfect family life with Linda and their 2 young children. Greg's house in Shaker Heights was everything my modest childhood home wasn't: sprawling, pristine, and cold. My cousins Mark and Jenna had their own spacious bedrooms with walk-in closets and private bathrooms, while I was given the converted basement guest room with its damp concrete walls and single small window. When relatives visited, Greg would joke about how I'd made myself right at home in the dungeon, always followed by his trademark booming laugh. School became my refuge, but even my academic achievements were twisted into sources of shame. When I won the county math competition in 5th grade, Greg's congratulations came with a backhanded slap. "Well, at least she's good for something. Too bad being a math nerd doesn't pay the bills." When I received a full scholarship to Ohio State University, he made sure everyone knew it was need-based aid for poor kids, conveniently omitting that it was actually a merit scholarship for academic excellence. The constant comparisons began early and never stopped. Mark's Little League trophies were displayed prominently in the living room, while my academic awards were relegated to the basement bulletin board. When Jenna got her driver's license at 16, Greg threw her a party and bought her a used Honda Accord. When I turned 16, he handed me bus fare and told me public transportation would build character. College provided temporary escape, but Greg's influence followed me even there. During my freshman year at Ohio State, when I called to ask if I could come home for Thanksgiving, he sighed dramatically into the phone. "I suppose we can squeeze one more place setting at the table. Linda's already cooking for 20. What's one more mouth to feed?" The worst part wasn't the cruelty itself. It was how Greg had convinced the entire extended family that his treatment of me was not only acceptable, but generous. "Greg's doing so much for that girl," I'd overhear relatives whisper at family gatherings. "She should be grateful for everything he's given her." After graduation, when I landed my first job at a small accounting firm in downtown Cleveland, Greg's reaction was predictably dismissive. "Entry-level number crunching?" he'd tell anyone who would listen. "She'll probably be doing data entry for the rest of her life. Some people just aren't cut out for real success." When I moved into my first apartment, a tiny studio in Ohio City that I could barely afford, Greg made sure to visit with the entire family in tow. He walked around the 400-square-foot space with theatrical concern, pointing out the dated appliances, the thin walls, and the lack of a proper bedroom. "This is what happens when you don't plan for the future," he announced to Mark and Jenna, who were home from college. "Take notes. Kids, this is not where you want to end up." But perhaps the most devastating blow came when I turned 30. I had just received a significant promotion at North Star Advisory and finally felt like I was building something meaningful. I made the mistake of sharing my excitement at Greg's birthday party that year, hoping for once to receive genuine family support. "Assistant manager," Greg had repeated slowly, savoring each syllable like a bad joke. "At a firm nobody's ever heard of. Congratulations, Rachel. By the time you're 50, you might actually make it to middle management." The room had erupted in uncomfortable laughter, and I realized with crushing clarity that no achievement would ever be enough. Greg didn't just enjoy putting me down. He needed it. My failure was essential to his sense of superiority. My struggles a confirmation of his own success. That night, driving home in defeat, I'd made a decision that would change everything. If Greg wanted to see me as a failure, I would let him. I would live modestly, dress simply, and keep my growing financial success completely hidden. Let him think I was barely surviving while I quietly built an empire he couldn't even imagine. For 6 years, I'd maintained this careful facade, watching my investment portfolio grow from thousands to millions while Greg continued his public humiliations. I endured his jokes about my sad little life, his pointed comments about my lack of ambition, and his constant comparisons to my more successful cousins. But tonight's performance at Romano's had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. The word mediocrity echoed in my mind like a war drum, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The scared 8-year-old girl who had absorbed his cruelty for decades was finally gone, replaced by someone much more dangerous. As I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I sat in my car for a long moment, staring up at the modest building I called home. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of showing Uncle Greg exactly what kind of mediocrity $51 million could buy. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. in my supposedly sad little apartment and smiled as I checked my phone. 3 different investment apps showed the same beautiful reality that Uncle Greg could never imagine my portfolio had grown another $42,000 overnight, thanks to some strategic tech stock positions. What he saw as my pathetic 800-square-foot rental was actually a carefully calculated decision. Why waste money on appearances when I could be building real wealth? I made my usual black coffee in the compact kitchen Greg had mocked so thoroughly, then settled at my second-hand dining table with my laptop. The irony of my situation never got old, while Greg flaunted his expensive lifestyle with flashy cars and designer clothes. I had been quietly amassing a fortune that would make his net worth look like pocket change. It had started innocently enough during my junior year at Ohio State, While my finance classmates were maxing out credit cards and living off ramen noodles, I was working 3 part-time jobs and funneling every spare dollar into carefully researched investments. My professors had taught us about compound interest and market analysis, but I took it to an obsessive level, studying company fundamentals until 2 o'clock in the morning while my roommates partied. My first big win came from a small biotech company that nobody was paying attention to. I'd read their clinical trial reports and recognized the potential months before Wall Street caught on. When the FDA approved their new diabetes treatment, my $5,000 investment became $23,000 overnight. Most college students would have blown that money on spring break or a new car. I reinvested every penny. After graduation, while Greg was telling everyone I'd be shuffling papers for pennies, I was actually landing a position at North Star Advisory specifically because of my proven track record with personal investments. My boss, David Martinez, had been impressed enough by my portfolio management skills to fast-track me into handling high-net-worth clients. Within 2 years, I was managing portfolios worth tens of millions, learning from Cleveland's wealthiest families how they thought about money and power. The real game changer came when I was 28. One of my clients, an elderly tech entrepreneur named Eleanor Hartwell, took me under her wing after I helped her navigate a complex merger that saved her company millions. She taught me about angel investing and introduced me to her network of startup founders. When a young programmer pitched his revolutionary data analytics platform, I saw the potential immediately and convinced Eleanor to let me co-invest. 18 months later, Google acquired that little startup for $800 million. My $200,000 investment became $14.7 million in cash and Google stock. Eleanor, impressed by my instincts, offered to mentor me further and help me access even more exclusive investment opportunities. From there, my wealth snowballed through a combination of calculated risks and patient diversification. I bought into 3 more startups before they went public, acquired several rental properties in up-and-coming Cleveland neighborhoods, and made strategic investments in emerging markets that my research suggested were undervalued. Each success gave me access to better opportunities, creating a virtuous cycle that Greg's small-minded thinking could never comprehend. The most delicious part was maintaining my modest lifestyle while my net worth exploded. I kept driving my reliable Honda Civic while secretly owning a portfolio of rental properties across 3 states. I shopped at Target and Kroger while my investment accounts generated more money each month than most people made in a year. I lived in my compact apartment while having enough liquid assets to buy Greg's entire neighborhood if I wanted to. My financial advisor, Patricia Kim at Meridian Wealth Management, had been trying to convince me for years to upgrade my lifestyle. "Rachel," she'd say during our quarterly meetings, "you're worth more than $50 million now. You could buy a mansion, travel the world, live like the wealthy woman you are." But she didn't understand the psychological advantage of invisibility. Every family gathering where Greg mocked my failures was actually intelligence gathering. I learned about his business struggles, his mounting debts, and his desperate need for capital, all while he assumed I was too financially ignorant to understand what he was revealing. Greg's construction supply company, Monroe Materials, had been struggling for the past 3 years. The commercial construction market in Cleveland had become increasingly competitive, and Greg's old-school management style wasn't adapting well to modern business practices. He'd lost several major contracts to more innovative competitors, and his profit margins were shrinking dramatically. What Greg didn't realize was that several of his biggest clients were also my clients at North Star Advisory. Through casual conversations and legitimate business interactions, I'd learned that Monroe Materials was consistently late on deliveries, had quality control issues, and was developing a reputation for unreliability. The company was hemorrhaging money, and Greg was using personal guarantees to keep securing loans. Last month, during a family barbecue at Greg's house, I'd overheard him on the phone with his accountant, speaking in hushed tones about restructuring debt and finding new investors. He'd mentioned specific dollar amounts that I recognized as signs of serious financial distress. While he was outside, desperately trying to save his business, I was inside his kitchen, politely helping Linda with the dishes and mentally calculating exactly how much it would cost to buy him out completely. The beautiful irony was that Greg had created the perfect trap for himself. His constant need to humiliate me in front of the family meant he never suspected I might be listening with more than hurt feelings. Every cruel joke about my finances was actually valuable intelligence about his own desperation. As I finished my coffee and prepared for another day at North Star Advisory, I opened my laptop and began researching Monroe Materials' corporate structure. The company was privately held, which made acquisition more complex but not impossible. I would need to approach this carefully, through intermediaries and shell companies, to avoid arousing suspicion until it was too late for Greg to react. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Jenna. "Hope you're okay after last night." Uncle Greg was pretty harsh, even for him. I smiled as I typed back, "Thanks for checking on me. I'm doing just fine." If only she knew how fine I really was, and how much trouble Uncle Greg was actually in. The breaking point came 3 weeks later at what should have been a pleasant Easter brunch at Aunt Margaret's house in Lakewood. I had arrived early to help with preparations, genuinely trying to contribute to the family gathering despite the lingering sting from Uncle Greg's recent humiliation. The morning had started peacefully enough. I was arranging flowers in the dining room when I heard Greg's voice booming from the kitchen. You know what the real problem is with Rachel," he was saying to a group of relatives who had gathered around the coffee pot. I froze behind the dining room wall, recognizing that tone. He was building up to something big. "The real problem," Greg continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed his own wisdom was profound, "is that she's never learned what it means to be a real woman. Look at her, 36 years old, no husband, no children, no home of her own. She's basically a glorified spinster playing dress-up in the business world." I heard nervous laughter from the kitchen, the kind that people make when they're uncomfortable but don't want to confront the speaker. My hands gripped the flower stems so tightly that thorns pierced my palms. "I mean, what kind of man would want to settle down with someone like that?" Greg's voice grew more animated as he warmed to his theme. "She's got no domestic skills, no maternal instincts, and let's be honest, no real earning potential. She's basically worthless in the marriage market." Aunt Linda's voice chimed in with false sympathy. "Oh, Greg, don't be so harsh. I'm sure Rachel will find someone eventually. Maybe someone with lower standards." The kitchen erupted in laughter that felt like physical blows. I stood paralyzed in the dining room, my face burning with shame and rage as I listened to my own family dissect my worth as a human being over Easter coffee. "The thing is," Greg continued, clearly enjoying his audience, "I've tried to help her over the years. God knows I've tried. But you can't fix someone who fundamentally doesn't understand how the world works. She's always been content with mediocrity, never pushed herself to be better." Uncle Robert's voice joined the conversation. "What about that job of hers? Doesn't she work in finance or something?" Greg's laugh was particularly cruel. "She's a paper pusher at some tiny firm downtown, probably makes 35, maybe 40,000 a year if she's lucky. I've seen her apartment. Rob, it's basically a college dorm room. She doesn't even own a proper dining table." "That's so sad," I heard Cousin Sarah say. "At her age, shouldn't she at least have her life somewhat together?" "That's exactly my point," Greg said triumphantly. "Some people are just born to be followers, to live small lives and be grateful for scraps. Rachel's always been one of those people. No vision, no ambition, no fire in her belly. She's perfectly content being ordinary." The word ordinary hit me like a slap, but it was what came next that shattered something fundamental inside me. "Honestly," Greg said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper but was still perfectly audible. "Sometimes I wonder if her parents would be disappointed in how she turned out. Tom and Sarah were such vibrant, successful people. They had dreams. They took risks. They built something meaningful with their lives. And their daughter, well, she's basically everything they weren't." The mention of my parents felt like sacrilege. The flowers fell from my numb hands as I stumbled backward, my vision blurring with tears of pure rage. Greg had crossed every possible line. He wasn't just attacking my lifestyle or my choices anymore. He was desecrating the memory of the two people who had loved me unconditionally. I think, Greg continued, completely unaware of the devastation he was causing. If Tom could see Rachel now, living in that pathetic little apartment and working her dead-end job, he'd realize that all his hopes and dreams for her were just wishful thinking. Some people are destined for greatness, and others are destined to, well, to be Rachel. The kitchen fell silent for a moment before Linda spoke up.
Greg, maybe that's enough.
No, Linda, someone needs to say it. Greg interrupted. We've all been tiptoeing around the truth for years. Rachel is a disappointment. She's a 36-year-old woman with nothing to show for her life except a rental agreement and a mediocre job. And the sooner she accepts that reality, the sooner she can stop pretending she's going to amount to something special. I stood in that dining room for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, letting Greg's words wash over me like acid. The cruelty wasn't just in what he was saying. It was in how casually he was saying it, how comfortable he felt destroying me in front of our entire family on Easter Sunday. But something strange happened as I stood there absorbing his verbal assault. The hurt began to transform into something much colder and more focused. Greg's words weren't just revealing his opinion of me, they were revealing his complete ignorance of reality. Every cruel observation about my financial situation, every mocking comment about my prospects, every dismissive joke about my future was proof of how utterly blind he was to the truth. I walked quietly to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the failure Greg described. She was someone with the power to buy and sell his entire life several times over. The worthless spinster he'd just mocked controlled enough wealth to crush his business and destroy his reputation without breaking a sweat. When I returned to the dining room, the family was gathering around Aunt Margaret's beautifully set table. Greg was holding court at the head, regaling everyone with stories about his latest business ventures while completely unaware that his company was 3 months away from bankruptcy. As I took my seat at the far end of the table, the spot reserved for the family disappointment, I made a decision that felt as final as a door slamming shut. Greg wanted to talk about being destined for greatness versus being destined for mediocrity. I was about to show him the difference between someone who built real power and someone who just talked about it. The next phase of my plan would require patience, precision, and absolute secrecy. But sitting there, listening to Greg laugh and joke while his financial empire crumbled around him, I realized I had been patient enough. It was time for Uncle Greg to learn what disappointment really looked like. The Monday morning after Easter brunch, I sat in my office at North Star Advisory at exactly 7:15 a.m., 2 hours before my official start time. The building was nearly empty, which gave me the privacy I needed for the phone calls that would set everything in motion. I had spent the entire weekend researching Monroe Materials' financial structure, and what I discovered was even worse than I had suspected. My first call was to Marcus Webb, a corporate attorney I'd worked with on several client acquisitions. Marcus specialized in distressed asset purchases and had a reputation for absolute discretion, qualities I would need in abundance over the next few months.
Rachel, good to hear from you,
Marcus said when his secretary connected us. What can I do for you? I need to discuss a potential acquisition, but this one requires complete confidentiality, I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. I'm talking about multiple shell companies, non-disclosure agreements for everyone involved, and zero connection to my name until the deal is finalized. There was a pause. Marcus had handled enough sensitive transactions to recognize when a client had serious intentions. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Fast. The target company is Monroe Materials, a construction supply business here in Cleveland. They're privately held and hemorrhaging money, but the owner doesn't know I'm interested yet.
I'll need 24 hours to run preliminary research,
Marcus said. Can you send me everything you have on their corporate structure? My second call was to Jennifer Walsh, a private investigator who specialized in corporate intelligence. Jennifer had helped several of my wealthy clients navigate complex business situations, and her thoroughness was legendary. "I need a complete financial profile on a company and its owner," I told her. "Bank records, loan agreements, supplier relationships, customer contracts, everything you can legally obtain." "How deep do you want me to dig?" Jennifer asked. "Deep enough to know exactly how desperate they are," I replied. "I need leverage points, pressure spots, and a clear picture of their cash flow situation." Timeline: 2 weeks maximum. Money is no object. My third call was the most delicate. Thomas Bradley ran a boutique investment firm that specialized in acquiring distressed businesses through intermediary companies. His clients valued anonymity, and Thomas had perfected the art of corporate acquisition through layers of legal separation. "I have an interesting proposition," I told him after explaining my needs. "I want to acquire a failing company, but the current owner cannot know I'm the buyer until after the papers are signed." Thomas chuckled. "Family business." "Something like that," I said. "The owner has a personal relationship with me that would complicate direct negotiations." "Ah, the best kind of deal," Thomas said. "Personal motivation always makes for more satisfying victories. What's your budget?" Whatever it takes. The company is probably worth around 8 to 12 million in assets, but they're carrying significant debt. I'm prepared to go up to 20 million if necessary to ensure a clean acquisition." "Consider it done. I'll set up a series of shell companies and approach them through what appears to be a standard distressed asset fund. They'll never see you coming." Over the next 2 weeks, while Greg continued his family campaign of humiliation, including a particularly vicious performance at Cousin Mark's promotion party where he speculated loudly about my biological clock running out, my team of professionals began dissecting his business empire with surgical precision. Jennifer's investigation revealed the full scope of Monroe Materials' problems. The company owed nearly $4 million to various suppliers, had 3 outstanding lawsuits from customers claiming defective materials, and was behind on rent for their main warehouse facility. Greg had personally guaranteed most of the company's loans, meaning his house and personal assets were at risk if the business failed. More importantly, Jennifer discovered that Greg had been shopping the company to potential investors for months. Growing increasingly desperate as rejection letters piled up, his asking price had dropped from $15 million to $8 million, and he was now considering offers as low as $6 million just to escape the mounting debt. Marcus's legal research uncovered even more vulnerabilities. Monroe Materials was structured as a closely held corporation with Greg owning 75% and his silent business partner, Frank Morrison, owning 25%. Frank, it turned out, was a retired construction contractor who had invested in the company 5 years ago and was now eager to cut his losses. "Morrison is the weak link," Marcus told me during our second meeting. "He's tired of losing money and has no emotional attachment to the business. If we approach him first and buy out his stake, Greg will be isolated and much more likely to accept our final offer." Thomas's team moved with impressive efficiency. Within 10 days, they had established 3 separate investment entities: Midwest Capital Ventures, Great Lakes Asset Management, and Cleveland Commercial Holdings. On paper, these companies appeared to be part of a larger investment fund specializing in regional manufacturing and supply businesses. The first contact came through Frank Morrison. Thomas's representatives approached him as investors interested in the construction supply sector, mentioning that they had heard Monroe Materials might be available for the right price. Frank, desperate to escape his failing investment, agreed to sell his 25% stake for $1.2 million, exactly what he had invested 5 years earlier. The beauty of this approach was that Greg remained completely unaware of the acquisition. Corporate ownership transfers happened constantly in business, and Frank's sale of his minority stake seemed like a routine transaction. Greg was simply informed that he had a new business partner, Midwest Capital Ventures, and that they were interested in potentially increasing their investment if the numbers looked good. Meanwhile, I continued my role as the family disappointment with Oscar-worthy dedication. At my cousin Jenna's housewarming party, I endured another round of Greg's public mockery, this time focused on my tragic inability to find a decent man and my biological destiny as a spinster. I smiled politely, complimented Jenna's new granite countertops, and mentally calculated that the commission from her latest real estate sale was roughly equivalent to what my portfolio earned in passive income every 6 hours. The preliminary negotiations began in mid-May. Thomas's team, now controlling 25% of Monroe Materials through their purchase of Frank's stake, requested a comprehensive business review to assess the potential for additional investment. Greg, smelling potential salvation, eagerly opened his books to what he believed were serious investors with deep pockets. What he revealed was even worse than my investigation had suggested. Monthly cash flow was negative by nearly $200,000. The company had lost 4 major contracts in the past 6 months, and Greg had been using company credit lines to make mortgage payments on his personal residence.
He's drowning, Thomas reported during our weekly update call. The man is about 3 months away from bankruptcy, and he knows it. He's so desperate for capital that he's willing to give up majority control just to stay afloat.
How long before we make the final move? I asked. 2 weeks. We need to let him sweat a little more, maybe lose another contract or 2. The more desperate he becomes, the more likely he is to accept our terms without extensive due diligence. As I hung up the phone, I looked out my office window at the Cleveland skyline and smiled. Uncle Greg had spent decades teaching me about power dynamics, about the difference between winners and losers, about what happened to people who failed to plan for the future. In 2 weeks, he was about to receive the most comprehensive education of his life. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 10:45 a.m. while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk. Greg's voice practically vibrated with excitement through my phone speaker, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share what he believed was spectacular news.
"Rachel, sweetheart, you'll never guess what just happened,"
he boomed, and I could practically see him pacing around his office with that smug grin I knew so well.
"I'm about to close the deal of a lifetime. A major investment group wants to buy into Monroe Materials. We're talking serious money here, enough to not just save the company, but expand into 3 new markets."
I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, savoring every word.
"That's wonderful, Uncle Greg. You must be so relieved."
"Relieved, honey. I'm beyond relieved. I'm vindicated." His laugh had that familiar edge of superiority. "This proves everything I've been saying about building real wealth, taking real risks. While some people are content with their little jobs and tiny apartments, real entrepreneurs find ways to attract serious capital." The dig was so perfectly Greg that I almost laughed out loud. Here he was, about to sell his failing company to me, and he was still using it as an opportunity to mock my supposed mediocrity.
"The investors want to meet this Friday," Greg continued. "Big conference room, fancy lawyers, the whole 9 yards. They're flying in from Chicago specifically for this deal. Can you imagine all those years of building Monroe Materials? And now it's finally paying off in a big way."
"I'm so happy for you," I said, injecting genuine warmth into my voice. "You deserve this success after working so hard." "Exactly. Finally, someone who gets it." Greg's voice swelled with pride. "I've been telling Linda we should have a big celebration dinner this weekend. The whole family should be there to witness this moment. After all, it's not every day someone pulls off a deal this significant." My pulse quickened. Greg was practically writing my revenge script for me.
"That sounds like a wonderful idea. I'd love to be there to celebrate with you."
"Of course you'll be there. Your family, even if—" He paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "Well, even if you haven't quite figured out your own path yet, maybe being around real success will inspire you to think bigger about your own future." I bit my tongue and maintained my role.
"I hope so, Uncle Greg. I really admire what you've accomplished."
"That's the spirit, you know. Rachel, I've always believed that success is contagious. Maybe if you spend more time around winners instead of settling for that little office job, Some of that ambition might rub off on you. After Greg hung up, I sat in my office for several minutes, staring out at downtown Cleveland and processing the beautiful irony of what had just happened. Greg was so convinced of his own brilliance that he was planning a family celebration for the very deal that would destroy him. He wanted the entire family there to witness his moment of triumph, the moment when he would unknowingly hand his life's work over to the disappointment he'd spent decades humiliating. I called Thomas immediately. He took the bait completely. He's planning a family celebration for after the deal closes. Perfect, Thomas said. My team is ready for Friday's meeting. We've prepared a standard acquisition contract that gives him exactly what he thinks he wants: immediate cash injection, retained management role, and apparent respect for his business acumen. He'll never see the fine print coming. And the reveal? That's entirely up to you. The contracts include a clause requiring board approval for all major decisions, and since we'll control 60% of the company through various entities, we can restructure however we want. When do you want to step out from behind the curtain? I thought about Greg's excited voice, his plans for a celebration dinner, his absolute certainty that he was about to prove his superiority to the entire family. Let him have his moment on Friday. Let him sign the papers and feel like he's won. Then we'll schedule a board meeting for Monday morning. And you'll be there in person? Oh, yes, I said, feeling a smile spread across my face. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Friday arrived with unseasonably warm weather for early June. I spent the morning at North Star Advisory, handling routine client calls while mentally rehearsing the conversation I would have with Greg on Monday. Thomas texted me updates throughout the morning as his team prepared for the 1:00 meeting at Monroe Materials. At 12:30 p.m., my phone buzzed with another text from Greg. Walking into the biggest meeting of my life right now. Wish me luck, Uncle Greg. I typed back, good luck, I know you'll do great. For the next 2 hours, I tried to focus on work while imagining Greg in his best suit, probably the navy one he wore to important occasions, shaking hands with Thomas's representatives and believing he was saving his empire. I pictured him reviewing contracts with his lawyer, asking careful questions about terms and conditions, never suspecting that every clause had been designed to transfer real control away from him. At 3:15 p.m., my phone rang. Greg's voice was so jubilant I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Rachel, we did it. The deal is signed, sealed, and delivered, he practically shouted. $8.2 million, plus they're keeping me on as CEO with full operational control. I just turned Monroe Materials from a struggling family business into a major regional player overnight. Congratulations, Uncle Greg. That's incredible news. Incredible doesn't begin to cover it. These investors, they understand vision. They understand what it takes to build something real, not like those small-time lenders who couldn't see past quarterly reports. He paused for dramatic effect. Linda's already making reservations at Blue, that new steakhouse downtown. Saturday night, 7 o'clock, the whole family. I want everyone there to see what real success looks like. I'll be there, I promised. Good. And Rachel. His voice took on that familiar, condescending tone. I hope you'll pay attention Saturday night. Watch how people react when someone achieves something truly significant. Maybe it'll motivate you to set some bigger goals for yourself. After he hung up, I sat quietly in my office as the sun slanted through my windows, casting long shadows across my desk. In 72 hours, Greg would walk into what he thought was a routine board meeting and discover that his failure of a niece now owned his life's work. The woman he'd mocked for having no ambition, no vision, and no understanding of real success would be sitting at the head of his conference table with the power to decide his future. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my assistant, requesting that Monday morning be kept completely clear. Then I called my personal stylist and made an appointment for Saturday afternoon. If Uncle Greg wanted the whole family to witness what real success looked like, I was going to make sure they got an unforgettable education. The celebration dinner was going to be even more memorable than Greg imagined. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly. Typical Cleveland weather that matched my mood perfectly as I prepared for the most satisfying meeting of my life. I had spent the weekend enduring Greg's victory celebration at Blue Steakhouse, where he held court like a conquering hero while I played my role as the admiring niece one final time. Now, at 8:45 a.m., I sat in my car outside Monroe Materials, watching Greg's silver Mercedes pull into his reserved parking spot. The building looked smaller than I remembered from my research photos, a modest two-story structure in an industrial district that had seen better days. Greg climbed out of his car with the confident swagger of a man who believed he had just saved his empire, adjusting his tie and checking his watch as he headed for the entrance. I waited exactly 10 minutes before following him inside, giving him time to settle into his office and start his day as usual. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Carol, looked up with surprise when I approached her desk. "Good morning," I said with a professional smile. "I'm here for the 9:30 board meeting, Rachel Monroe." Carol's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, you're Mr. Monroe's niece, aren't you? I've seen you at the company picnics." "That's right," I confirmed, enjoying the confusion in her voice. "Could you please let the participants know I'm here?" She fumbled with her phone, clearly flustered by my unexpected presence. Within minutes, Thomas Bradley emerged from the conference room, followed by two other men I recognized as his legal team. Thomas nodded at me with professional courtesy, maintaining the fiction that we were meeting for the first time. "Ms. Monroe, I presume I'm Thomas Bradley from Midwest Capital Ventures. We're ready to begin when you are." The conference room door opened, and Greg appeared, his face already showing signs of confusion. He was dressed in his best suit again, clearly expecting another celebration of his business acumen. When he saw me standing with the investors, his expression shifted to bewilderment. "Rachel, what are you doing here, sweetheart? Did you come to see Uncle Greg's big business meeting?" His tone was patronizing, as if I were a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. Thomas cleared his throat. "Mr. Monroe, perhaps we should all take our seats. There are some important matters to discuss regarding the ownership structure of Monroe Materials." We filed into the conference room, a sterile space with a long wooden table and cheap office chairs. Greg took his usual seat at the head of the table, while I chose a chair directly across from him. Thomas and his team arranged themselves along the sides, their briefcases and documents creating an atmosphere of serious business. "Shh, gentlemen," Greg began with his usual bluster. "I have to say, Friday's transaction exceeded all my expectations. I'm excited to discuss our expansion plans and—" "Mr. Monroe," Thomas interrupted gently. "Before we proceed, I need to clarify something important about the current ownership structure." Greg's confident smile faltered slightly. "Ownership structure, I thought we covered all that in Friday's contracts." Thomas opened his briefcase and removed a stack of documents. "These papers detail the actual corporate hierarchy following our recent transactions. As you'll see, the situation is somewhat different from what you may have understood." I watched Greg's face as Thomas began explaining the web of shell companies, stock transfers, and board compositions that had been carefully constructed over the past months. With each revelation, Greg's complexion grew paler, his confident posture slowly deflating like a punctured balloon. "What you're saying," Greg said slowly, his voice losing its usual boom, "is that I no longer have majority control of my own company?" "That's correct," Thomas confirmed. "Following the acquisition of Mr. Morrison's stake and our subsequent purchase agreement, Monroe Materials is now controlled by a consortium of investment entities. You retain a significant minority position and your role as operational manager, subject to board approval." Greg's eyes darted around the table, searching for understanding. "But who actually controls these investment entities? Who am I really working for now?" This was the moment I had been waiting for, the culmination of years of humiliation and decades of condescension. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm and steady. "You're working for me, Uncle Greg." The silence that followed was absolute. Greg stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking older and smaller than I had ever seen him. That's impossible," he whispered. You work at some little office downtown. You don't have this kind of money." I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing summary documents of my financial holdings, investment portfolio, and the corporate structure Thomas had created on my behalf. I slid it across the table to Greg with deliberate precision. "I have $51 million in liquid assets, Uncle Greg. The little office downtown is North Star Advisory, where I manage portfolios worth hundreds of millions. The sad little apartment you've mocked so many times is a choice, not a limitation." Greg opened the folder with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the documents that detailed my wealth in stark, undeniable numbers. Bank statements, investment summaries, property holdings, everything he had assumed was impossible for someone like me. "This can't be real," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. How did you? "I've been building this for 15 years, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Every time you mocked my mediocre job, I was actually learning from Cleveland's wealthiest families. Every time you laughed at my tiny apartment, I was investing the money I saved on rent. Every time you told everyone I was a failure, I was getting richer." Thomas pulled out another set of documents. "Ms. Monroe now controls 68% of Monroe Materials through various investment vehicles. As the majority shareholder, she has requested this meeting to discuss the company's future direction." Greg looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not mockery, not condescension, but something approaching fear. "Rachel, sweetheart, surely we can work something out. I mean, family is family. Right, I was always just trying to motivate you, to help you reach your potential." I studied his face for a long moment, remembering every cruel joke, every public humiliation, every time he had made me feel worthless in front of our family. The scared 8-year-old girl who had absorbed his cruelty for so many years was finally gone, replaced by someone who held his entire future in her hands. "Uncle Greg," I said softly, "do you remember what you told me at Romano's, that some people are destined for greatness, and others are destined to be ordinary?" He nodded wordlessly, his eyes pleading. "Well," I continued, letting a small smile play at the corners of my mouth, "I guess we're about to find out which one of us was really destined for what." 6 months later, I stood behind the podium at the Cleveland Convention Center, camera flashes illuminating my face as I addressed a packed auditorium of business leaders, journalists, and curious onlookers. The banner behind me read, "Monroe Industries, a new vision for Cleveland manufacturing," and the transformation had been nothing short of spectacular. "Well, when I acquired Monroe Materials," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the large space, "many people wondered why a successful financial advisor would want to enter the construction supply business." In the audience, I could see Uncle Greg sitting in the back row, no longer the confident patriarch who had once commanded every family gathering. The past 6 months had aged him considerably. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing, his luxury car traded for a modest sedan, and his booming voice reduced to quiet conversations with the few friends who still returned his calls. "The answer," I continued, "is that sometimes the best investments aren't just about financial returns. Sometimes they're about transformation, about taking something that was failing due to poor leadership and outdated thinking, and showing what's possible with vision and proper management." The irony was delicious. Greg had spent decades lecturing me about vision and leadership, never realizing that I had been quietly developing both while he rested on his laurels and lived off past successes. "Under previous management," I said, letting my eyes find Greg in the crowd, "Monroe Materials was hemorrhaging money, losing contracts, and facing bankruptcy. Today, renamed Monroe Industries, we've increased revenue by 300%, expanded into 4 new markets, and become the largest construction supplier in northeastern Ohio."
The transformation had been swift and brutal. My first act as majority owner was to implement modern inventory management systems, replacing Greg's antiquated paper-based tracking with cutting-edge software. I brought in new suppliers, renegotiated contracts, and hired a team of young, aggressive salespeople who understood contemporary business practices. Greg had initially tried to maintain his authority, arriving each morning with suggestions and directives that ignored the new reality. I had allowed him exactly 1 week of this delusion before calling a staff meeting that clarified the chain of command. In front of his longtime employees, I had calmly explained that all major decisions now required my approval, and that his role was strictly operational. "But this is my company," he had protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "I built this business from nothing." "Actually," I had replied with professional courtesy, "this is my company now. You built something that was about to collapse. I'm building something that will last." The local business media had covered the story extensively, fascinated by the narrative of a quiet financial advisor who had secretly orchestrated the acquisition of a failing family business. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a feature article titled "The Niece Who Knew Better," while Crane's Cleveland Business put me on their cover with the headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight: How Rachel Monroe Built a Fortune While Her Family Wasn't Looking." The most satisfying coverage came from Channel 5's business segment, which interviewed several family members about their complete shock at discovering my true financial status. Cousin Mark had stammered through his answers, clearly struggling to reconcile the successful businesswoman on screen with the failure they had all pitied for years. "I mean, we had no idea," Jenna had said during her interview, her perfectly styled hair and makeup unable to hide her obvious discomfort. "Rachel always seemed so ordinary. She never talked about having money or investments or anything like that." The reporter had pressed further. "Did your family ever ask Rachel about her work or her financial situation?" Jenna's pause was telling. "Well, Uncle Greg always said she worked at some small firm downtown. We just assumed. I mean, she lived in that tiny apartment and drove that old car." What none of them understood was that their assumptions had been my greatest asset. While they were focused on appearances and status symbols, I had been focused on building real wealth. While they were spending money to look successful, I was actually becoming successful. Now, standing at the podium as the CEO of Monroe Industries, I was finally able to reveal the full scope of what I had accomplished. "This company's transformation represents more than just business success," I told the audience. "It represents the power of quiet determination, strategic thinking, and long-term vision over flashy rhetoric and short-term thinking." In the Q&A session that followed, a reporter from the Business Journal asked the question I had been expecting. "Ms. Monroe, there are reports that you had a difficult relationship with the company's previous owner, your uncle Gregory Monroe. How has that affected your approach to running the business?" I looked directly at Greg as I answered. "Family relationships can be complicated," I said diplomatically. "What I've learned is that success isn't about who talks the loudest or who claims the most credit. It's about who does the work, who makes the smart decisions, and who has the discipline to execute a long-term plan." After the press conference, as the crowd dispersed and reporters packed up their equipment, Greg approached me near the side exit. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of his new circumstances. "Rachel," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something." I turned to face him, noting how different he seemed without his usual bluster and bravado. "What is it, Uncle Greg?" "Was this all planned? Did you know years ago that you were going to do this to me?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said honestly. "For most of those years, I was just trying to survive your constant criticism and build something for myself. The plan to acquire your company only formed after you made it clear that humiliating me was more important to you than understanding who I really was." He nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of regret and resignation. "I suppose I deserve this." You taught me everything I needed to know about power. Uncle Greg," I replied, "you taught me that people will underestimate you if you let them, that appearances often matter more than reality,
and that the person who controls the money ultimately controls everything else. As I walked toward my car, no longer the modest Honda Civic, but a sleek BMW that reflected my true financial status, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared, insecure girl who had absorbed years of humiliation was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't just getting even, but getting ahead so far that your former tormentors could never catch up. Greg had spent decades teaching me that I was ordinary, mediocre, destined for small things. In the end, his greatest lesson was unintentional. He taught me that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. Thank you for listening to this story of triumph and transformation. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story right now? Are you at home, commuting to work, or perhaps taking a break from your own challenging situation? Please leave a comment below sharing where you're listening from and what this story means to you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of perseverance and unexpected victory. Your thoughts and experiences matter, and I'd love to connect with fellow listeners who understand that sometimes the greatest successes come from the most unlikely places.